Welcome to Wayne's World, rising above the noise and confusion.
It's Wayne's word.
Oh.
Our guest today is Colorado Attorney General Phil Weiser, a former law school dean who is running for governor. Voters first elected Mr. Weiser in 2018. He self-identifies as the people's lawyer, and in that capacity, Mr. Weiser knocked out Big Vape, generating settlement funds to pay for juvenile mental health services. He fights to protect children from internet dangers, and he also led the multi-state battle to stop the monopolization of Kroger and Albertson stores. That's King Soopers and Safeway, respectively, and a lot of other popular grocer brands. Mr. Weiser obtained unique insight into society and law by clerking for Supreme Court Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Byron Whizzer White, the latter of whom voted against the Roe v. Wade ruling of 1973, which Mr. Weiser supports. Most importantly, Phil and I have for years enjoyed geeking out over legal questions. He tolerates me. I learn from him. Welcome, Professor and Attorney General, to Wayne's Word.
Wayne, I really value this ongoing dialogue, and it's great to have you doing a podcast. I don't know what number guest I am, but I'm thrilled to be helping to get this launched and encourage more engaging discourse. Obviously, we see a number of things differently, but there's some things we really agree on too, and being able to chat about all that is important.
Tell me a little bit why you are running for governor. What would make you want to do something like that?
I care so deeply about Colorado, and I am so wired in terms of just my DNA to serve. My family story is a unique one. My mom and grandmother were Holocaust survivors liberated by the U.S. Army.
Yes.
They came to the United States as refugees, and I've been able to live a life of opportunity and freedom. And when I look at Colorado today, I'm concerned about where things are, that many people can't afford to buy a home or health care. The level of resilience that we have, whether it's wildfire resilience, protecting our land, air, and water, protecting public safety is top of mind. And you mentioned youth and the opportunities for our future. I'm really concerned on that front, on youth mental health, on people being prepared for jobs, and on people lacking a sense of purpose. So I see in Colorado a wonderful state I love. I see huge challenges, and I've been able to, as Attorney General, serve, show up in communities, work on issues like the opioid crisis, like vaping and youth mental health. I want to take the demonstrated leadership that I've been able to bring and bring it to the governor's office, where I will have even broader tools and ability to help us as Coloradans solve problems and be a beacon for the nation.
I'm the father of 6 boys, all boys, but all of them are young adults now, and so I know a lot of young adults. And I can tell you it is incredibly difficult for them to simply establish even a rental place to live in this state. And I think they're starting to leave our state for the first time in many generations. This was always a destination state, and now we're becoming an emigration state. What do you think is at the root of all of this? Why is it so hard to live in Colorado when you're just trying to get started out in life?
There are a few factors that are going on. First, we've been a popular place to move for a very long time. Basic supply and demand, more people moving here, us not building enough housing. I'm now living in Lowry, one of the new developments that happened that helped make Colorado affordable for people to move in. We built a lot of housing in Lowry, in the old Stapleton Airport, now Central Park. There's huge new housing available. We need to keep building more and more housing so there are options for people that are affordable. And that's a problem. Second problem, for people who are trying to rent, a lot of landlords have been engaging in fast and loose, irresponsible behavior. I can give you 2 examples literally from the last couple of weeks as Attorney General. One is a company called RealPage, which creates a software program that has said to major corporate landlords, all of you share your private information. What are you thinking about charging? What are you charging? And we'll tell you what to charge. This is what I would call newfangled price fixing. The old version was sit in a room. Everyone says, I'll raise my prices, you raise yours, we'll make more money. That type of price fixing by competitors is illegal. Here, it's being done by a software program. That's part of why we're seeing rents rise. In Colorado Springs, in Denver, it's a big deal. A study recently said $136 more a month because of this software program.
Would you call it collusion, what the software program is facilitating?
Yes, this is
Price
collusion.
collusion.
Price collusion, and it's It's wrong, and there's a lot of responsible landlords out there who are not using this program, who are doing things the old-fashioned way. They're competing in the marketplace. It's unfair to them, too, to allow these folks to collude and to make more money as a result. A second point, by the way, that's happening, called this insult on top of the injury, junk fees. We just brought a case literally the other day against Greystar. What they would do is they'd advertise, here's how much money it is to rent. Then you'd show up to sign the lease. You'd stop looking for other places. You were maybe ready to move in. And they said, oh, by the way, there's this fee and there's this other fee that they hadn't disclosed, thereby making the rent more expensive than it had been before. So this use of junk fees is a problem. We'd gone after another rental outfit in Boulder called 4-Star Realty. They had, for example, a moving out fee they charge people that hadn't been disclosed. That's another version of a junk fee. We got to fix this. People need to know the marketplace is fair. That's true for the responsible competitors who are doing things the right way. They shouldn't have to compete with irresponsible companies cutting corners, and consumers deserve fair treatment.
A lot of people would say, well, this is merely communication between people who are in similar business situations. They're both they're among landlords. It's communication so they can figure out what the fair market price is. Is there anything to that? I mean, you can look at it as collusion, or you can look at it as information sharing.
Information sharing that facilitates collusion is illegal. That's established in the antitrust laws. That's what we're talking about here. Yeah, they shared information, but I want to be clear. The way this program worked, it was even more than information sharing. They were suggesting the prices to both rivals to be offered, and they were telling them, in some cases, don't rent at all. Withhold supply from the marketplace, all with the goal of propping up prices. That type of collusion, that type of price fixing, even if accomplished by a software program, harms consumers and is illegal. That's why I'm on the case.
Sounds a lot like OPEC.
Yes.
Control the price of oil. You can control the price of housing.
Yes.
The market would want to provide where there is a demand. What is in the way of that right now? Why aren't we having the kind of houses built that people can afford when they're in their 20s or early 30s?
I'm going to offer a couple thoughts, and I want to highlight one of my goals in the campaign and getting out when I get out is to create a lot of opportunity for learning, for ideas, and for solutions to critical challenges. And the housing one is top of my list of a challenge that I am focused on. It's fair to say the Great Recession, the global financial crisis, it broke the housing market. We saw after 2008 housing construction and family apartment construction literally fall off a cliff. And it never recovered to where it was before. So there's a market failure that has happened. The market isn't functioning the way it should. There's a lot behind that. Not all of it have I figured out, but it's obviously something we've got to address as a society. In that sense, Colorado's not alone. Second, there are some communities, Minneapolis is one I understand, that have made steps to enable construction, that have removed barriers. And this is something that the legislature's been working on. Things like having to have artificial parking requirements is a big one people talk about. We got to make sure that we remove barriers, that we enable building. And that's something that a lot of communities are looking at really hard. How do we do that? And then third, where are there innovative solutions? Some people are doing more modular or prefabricated homes that have been built that you can have better economies of scale. It can be cheaper in many cases. We need all those sorts of solutions because we're in a hole right now. We have had too little supply and too much demand, and prices have gone way up as a result.
We've had a lot of obstruction, I think, in Colorado to construction. Maybe there is a Preble's meadow jumping mouse habitat nearby or on the location. Maybe there are too many prairie dogs nearby the location. There are all sorts of things, as you know, that pop up where we have to stop human progress. So you being a Democrat and going into the governor's office as a Democrat, how do you contend with that? That seems like a balance you would have to strike.
The point that you highlight, I want to use a adjacent example because it's one I've worked a lot on, clean water. And one of the issues that we've had as a nation is a question, how do we keep our waters clean? Historically, the Federal Clean Water Act had broad jurisdiction, and the EPA managed that system. Due to a Supreme Court case and efforts that have narrowed that jurisdiction, Colorado's now setting up our own State Clean Water Act where we didn't have to do it before. As we get that set up, I've focused intently on the following point, which is exactly what you're talking about. And you hear the phrase sometimes permitting reform. And this is an issue, by the way, when you talk about moving towards clean energy and renewable energy. We need a lot more capacity, transmission lines. If you can't get those permitted, you can't make the energy transition work. You can have great wind or solar in one area, the San Luis Valley, to take an example, but if there's no transmission to get it to where the population is, you haven't accomplished anything. So permitting is an issue that I am really concerned about. And how do we manage that when you have a permitting system to ensure that you're not having harmful environmental impacts or, in this case, harming the water? You got to move quickly. And this is why when we did that law, we set it up with certain timelines and certain structures so you wouldn't see the sorts of delays that are all too frustrating. Another point that I focused on a lot when you talk about building water infrastructure projects is instead of having the permits, and sometimes you got to get multiple permits from different authorities, one after the other, let's do them all at the same time. And cut down on the timing. So your point is one that I welcome for us to take on, which is how do we reduce barriers? How do we make the permitting process easier? I don't want to remove protections like for clean water, but I also don't want it to have the sort of huge delaying effect that I know can happen.
It sounds like you and Donald Trump have something in common there. I hope you don't take offense to that. But he did come in 2017 and start deregulating for that very purpose, so that we could move projects along. Do you think you, as governor of Colorado, could work with Donald Trump?
The point I've said again and again, if someone wants to help Colorado, whether it's building more housing, standing up for consumers, or ending robocalls, I'm going to work with them. And I did work with the first Trump administration on ending robocalls. His head of the Federal Communications Commission is someone I was able to work with, and other state AGs did on a bipartisan basis. And what we did is change the technologies so that these robocalls now automatically go through to voicemail. And then we also agreed to go after the intermediaries who are carrying these robocalls to stop the scourge. And robocalls aren't as bad as they were 6 years ago because of efforts that we took on a bipartisan basis. I'm suing Google right now. That suit started with the Trump administration, and I was working with the state AG coalition. It went to the Biden administration. It'll go back to the Trump administration. So when it comes to helping Colorado, I'll work with who's ever in Washington. And if someone in Washington wants to harm Colorado, we've talked a lot about the methane rule. We can talk more about that. That's a rule that helps Colorado because it protects our air quality from Wyoming emissions. If the Trump administration wants to repeal that protection and harm air quality, I'm going to go to court to protect Colorado.
One of the things we hear frequently about why aren't there more condos and affordable housing, multifamily housing, is the construction defects law in Colorado, which basically makes it pretty easy to sue any investor or developer who builds something and maybe there's a faulty foundation on the severe end of it. But maybe it's something much more minor than that. But nevertheless, we hear from builders and investors that they're afraid of the liability attached because of that law.
I'm going to segue to this by talking about the methane rule because you didn't take the bait there. So I'm going to talk about the methane rule and segue to this because there's actually a through line. The methane rule was developed in Colorado when John Hickenlooper was governor. He had industry, oil and gas developers at the table, along with NGOs, non-governmental groups who were concerned about protecting our land, air, and water. And he said, how do we address this emission of methane during the oil and gas development process? And they came up with a state-of-the-art way that protects our air quality, and the industry said, we can do this. The EPA took our rule and took it nationally, which means Wyoming oil and gas developers have to follow this rule, and air goes from Wyoming to Colorado. So that was a great success story. The one you just said has a through line because what Jared Polis said at State of the State is we've got a problem. He put the statistics on the table, and I'm going to forget them exactly, but 25 years ago, he talked about the level of condo construction, and then he talked about what it is today. And he said the biggest difference that he thinks is driving it is a concern about are there threats of liability that are deterring construction. And he said, I want to make sure we've got a dialogue with everybody at the table to understand this point. And his goal is, can we make sure we're still protecting consumers if someone's doing something that's harming them, but we're also removing this threat of liability that can be a big barrier to the condo construction we need. And that sort of leadership of bringing people to the table to solve problems is how we roll in Colorado. It's why we're a national leader on many issues. And I applaud Governor Polis for calling for that conversation.
How do you feel about the governor's? I spoke with him last week, and I'd like to have him on the show here soon. But he was talking after his State of the State address. He was very much emphasizing the need to deregulate. You, having worked in the Federal Department of Justice, you have both been in favor of and opposed to regulations. How do you go about it? If you were elected governor, would you do what the governor wants to do with his remaining term and deregulate Colorado?
I am a longstanding student and practitioner of regulation. So I have thought very long and hard about what regulation we need and how to do it. And what I worry about, and this is important, Wayne, I think you and I agree on this, a lot of times in government, it's not necessarily who's in charge, Republicans or Democrats. It's whether things are on autopilot, inertia, or whether you've got an innovative problem solver who says, why are we doing this? And so what you're pointing to about Governor Polis's initiative and you're asking about is, should we always be rigorously evaluating how is this regulatory system working? Are there unintended consequences? Is it addressing what the initial concern was? Can we do a better way of regulating? Sometimes there's ways that are more like scalpel, if you will, as opposed to using a meat cleaver. And that is something that I have dedicated my career to, which is smart, effective regulation. If you want to understand how that works, for me, look at how we've done it in our office, because we have this law called the Colorado Privacy Act. It was the third such law in the nation. And I'm really proud of the way we worked to develop regulation. And one idea that we went for that California went it differently. California was more prescriptive, like use this specific technology or this way. I said, we're going to do it more principle-based. For example, companies have to do what we call a data protection assessment. We don't prescribe exactly how they have to do it. We say they need to make sure they do it that accomplishes these sorts of goals. And if they don't do it in a way that addresses those goals, they then have potential liability. We even, as the law was crafted, had a cure period. So if they hadn't done it, they could fix it. All because we want to make sure, and this is true with a lot of regulatory systems, that you're getting compliance. The methane rule is another example. You want to get compliance to protect air quality. If you have regulations that are dumb, are impossible to accomplish, or just creating unnecessary costs, people are going to be frustrated by that, and it's going to harm our economy. And so, yes, to your question, I'm all for smart, effective regulation, and that's something I'll continue to look at both in my job as Attorney General and if I get to be our next governor.
One area of regulation that you've played a major role in, both in Colorado and nationally, is antitrust regulation, which I'm a big believer in competition. I believe that competition improves things for consumers almost without exception. So tell me a little bit about your role as a regulator in terms of eliminating monopolies and potential monopolies.
We could have a whole conversation, Wayne, about the way in which antitrust and competition fits with regulation, because most antitrust practitioners and enforcers would have the following comment. The goal of antitrust law is to enable the market to work so you don't need regulation. Housing is a great example. If you have a housing market that is working effectively, consumers are being treated fairly, you have less concern that somehow people are getting hosed because you get the benefits of competition. If you have an agricultural and food system where you've got competition and people are being treated fairly, there's less call for regulation because people are getting choices and quality and local food options. What's happened in our economy that is reached, I believe, a scary situation is there's more and more consolidation. There's less and less competition. So whatever industries you're looking at, healthcare, big food, big pharma, big tech, you're seeing less competition, which means when a merger is proposed, it's really important that we analyze it and ask, is it going to harm competition and consumers? And that's the exact thing I did. You mentioned this, the Kroger-Albertsons case. And I want to give a big shout out to all the people of Colorado who engaged with our office, because I did something that hadn't been done before, but it's very part of my style. And I said to my team, we're going to do it. And they're like, okay. And we did it. We had 19 town halls. We had one here in Colorado Springs. And part of what I learned about is how in Colorado Springs, there are food deserts. Mm-hmm. There are communities that lack access to grocery stores. And what people said is, we're really worried if this merger happens, That's going to make that problem worse. More food deserts, less access to local fresh food, higher prices for consumers. Farmers are going to have a harder time selling their products. That type of concern is one I acted on, which is why I brought this case. For the first time in Colorado history, we litigated a case in Colorado State Court to stop a merger that was anti-competitive. That's to protect consumers.
Would you consider this a victory against that merger? You stopped it. It was your lawsuit that really stopped it.
This was a team effort, and it was an interesting case study because we brought a lawsuit in Colorado State Court. Washington brought their own lawsuit in Washington State Court. And the Federal Trade Commission, along with the bipartisan coalition of states, brought a lawsuit in federal court in Oregon. And the cumulative impact of those stopped this merger. I got to give you another fact, too, which is interesting. We opened up this investigation, and we found more collusion. This is your point that you raised earlier. Companies who are competing in the marketplace, supermarkets, cannot collude. They can't sit down with one another and say, you know what, let's not go after each other's customers. King Soopers and Safeway did that. It was during the strike that happened. They sat down and they said, we're not going to go after each other's pharmacy customers, which are among the most lucrative customers. And on top of that, they said, we're not going to hire each other's employees, which hurts workers. That type of collusion is illegal. So in addition to stopping the merger, we're going after this collusion that we know has harmed customers and workers.
You know, I always think this country is such a great place because you're pretty much free to do anything you want within reasonable constraints. You can come here from another country with nothing and simply scrape together some resources and start a small business, and it becomes a family business. And we see that all the time. But it seems, I always talk about when it comes to gun rights or even freedom of speech, these liberties were granted to us in the Constitution, but they can't simply exist in a void of morality and ethics. It seems to me, just like you wouldn't misuse your Second Amendment right to kill someone who doesn't deserve to be killed. You have no right to kill this person. You wouldn't use your First Amendment right to blatantly slander someone with malicious intent. Those things are illegal. What do you say to businesses, large and small, as to their responsibility to operate within the confines of some consideration for others and for society as a whole? Or do they just play by the rules and they can go as far as they want in terms of the rules?
This is another topic I wish we could have a whole conversation about.
Yeah.
Because I've thought a lot about this, and I've got to work as part of different businesses who had to decide how are we going to approach how we treat our customers, our employees. And I've seen, obviously, in my work as Attorney General, a lot of irresponsible businesses who are bad actors, who are wrongdoers, and who are harming people. Let me start with the extreme examples, because I know you and I have talked about them, and it blows the mind. There were people at Purdue Pharma or at Jewel who knew to a virtual certainty that they were making choices that were going to harm or kill people. And they said, maybe in these words, well, we're going to make a lot of money and we'll worry about the bad consequences later. I want to give you another story that I worked on personally, which is McKinsey, a consulting firm that is well known, had a couple of partners who consulted with Purdue Pharma. And when some of the pharmacies stopped making it so easy to get these addictive opioids, what did McKinsey and Purdue Pharma do? They said, how do we get around it? They didn't ask the question, maybe we're doing something wrong. So my message to businesses is do things the right way. Don't charge undisclosed deceptive fees at the last minute so your customer is tricked. That is not the right way to do business. Don't put products out there like OxyContin that you know are addictive and tell people, oh, don't worry about getting addicted. Nothing bad's going to happen. Don't market to teenagers on social media saying that juuling is cool and that you should be one of the cool kids who does something, vaping, that's harmful to your health and your mental health. I want to elevate and lift up the responsible businesses who treat their employees the right way, who treat their customers the right way, and who are good community citizens. In Colorado, we have so many great companies who do things the right way. They shouldn't have to compete with those who are cutting corners, breaking the law, and trying to get an unfair advantage on others.
Obviously, you were against collusion and monopolization and price fixing that occurs through monopolization and collusion. How do you feel about the flip side of that? I was speaking with Jared Polis about this recently. He capped the cost of insulin. He's talked about capping other prices. That is the flip side. That's government price fixing. Where do you stand on that? If you're going to be governor of Colorado, that's going to come across your desk frequently.
There are occasions where situations involve markets that have what I referred to before as a market failure. And the best situation for insulin would be we flood the zone with generic products for insulin, and it is inexpensive to get insulin. That's what should happen. That's the first best world.
A supply side solution. That almost always works.
That's my
it?
preference.
Yeah.
We did a study about insulin in our office. And what we found out is between these pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, and the people who then were producing insulin, there was so much consolidation and there was so much lockstep pricing that prices had gone through the roof for this essential service. And some people who were treating their diabetes were having to make terrible choices like, can I eat? Can I afford these bills, or can I afford my diabetes? So I will say this is an exceptional case where capping the price is justified because the market has failed and there has been, to my mind, what you might call implicit coordination. We don't have any evidence that they were colluding, but you look at the market structure, you look at the outcomes, something wrong happened here, and Colorado said, we're not going to tolerate it. We're going to put a cap. And that is an extreme step. It is an exceptional step. I believe it was warranted in insulin. I believe it was warranted in EpiPens. We're defending those cases in court because the people who would like to charge more are not happy. But I do believe those cases are justified.
Well, and I certainly see where they're justified in terms of great intent. But Richard Nixon thought gasoline was so important to the economy, so important to mere survival, that he capped the price in the 1970s, and then we all ended up waiting in gas lines. You couldn't get gas on certain days, depending whether you had an odd or even number at the end of your license plate. I was a kid, but I remember those days. That seems like an economic principle, like economic physics, if there is such a thing, that really can't be changed, unfortunately. I think we've seen the Danish producer. There's only two major producers of insulin, and one of them, as soon as these price caps started coming along, started reducing production. How do we contend with that into the equation?
That is a risk, and I am a skeptic of whether and when price regulation is appropriate, and you really want to make sure that you have a situation that involves a market failure. And my conclusion, we did a report on this, people can go ahead and pull up the report, is that this is a market that is being harmed through too little competition, too much concentration. And my hypothesis that Colorado law is now testing is that we could put this cap on, and it would still be plenty profitable for companies to produce insulin within the cap, and they would choose to do so. So it is a risk ever to do price regulation, and you put your finger on the risk. The risk is you end up essentially undermining the normal operation of the market, and you end up with artificial scarcity. I do believe this is an exceptional case. We did the work in the report to show it, and from my understanding, the cap is being complied with, and that the harm that you're suggesting isn't happening. Were it to happen, it'd be something we'd have to take a look at.
Let's talk about Juul. You had these two young men, Adam Monsees and James Bowen. I think they were both Stanford students or Stanford dropouts. That seems to be the trend in Silicon Valley is you drop out of Stanford and you're sort of more prestigious than people who don't. I don't understand that. It's kind of funny, though. But anyway, I think they fit this sort of standard stereotype of high-tech young men in Silicon Valley. And they came up with, they created this vaping craze. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's worse, Wayne. They were Stanford students. There's a book written about it. They looked at the files of Big Tobacco, and they looked at the whole Joe Camel story, which Big Tobacco was told you can't do that anymore. And they said, wait a minute, what if we used the same strategy, the same playbook, and we did it with vaping. And they decided they could make a lot of money. And so that's what they did.
And they knew they could probably make $1 billion or more.
It's a good question how much money they thought they were going to make, but I believe they ended up selling Juul for something north of $10 billion to, I think it was Altria, and that made them very wealthy. We sued them and the company and brought back $32 million to Colorado and changed how they operated. They have a lot to account for. And you before talked about social norms, and I think it's important that we as a society don't just say, if you make money at any cost, that's okay. We need to make sure that we are, as a society, setting a standard of how we expect people to behave, and doing something that is obviously and painfully harming people is never okay.
That's right. And I'm a free market, libertarian sort of free market capitalistic person. I believe in capitalism, and I believe it's the best way to distribute and provide. On the other hand, I think this system of freedom, this free capitalistic system that we are blessed with, again, it requires some level of morality and restraint, self-restraint, and concern for society. These fellas only cared about the money. I mean, I can't imagine you want to put a product out like this, and you know it's going to undo 30 or 40 or 50 years, I guess, of progress against teen nicotine use, and they choose the money instead of not doing that, protecting society from another round of big tobacco. I don't know how society functions if everyone who's in business decides that, let's just go for broke, let's just get all the money we can, we'll get rich while we're young, and to hell with the consequences.
Well, this is an important point, particularly given what you said. Any libertarian can and should acknowledge the following point. James Madison said, if people were angels, you wouldn't need government. You can be a hardcore free market person, believe in people's rights, live and let live, and also believe the following. If what you're doing is harming others, this is kind of John Stuart Mill, that's not okay. And government has a proper role to stop people from harming others. That can obviously mean you can't assault somebody else, you can't murder someone else. It also means you can't deceive someone, selling someone thinking that you're selling one thing, but it's really something else. And that's what junk fees do. They deceive someone into paying more for what they're getting. And with respect to harming people by selling a product that you say is safe, knowing it's not, again, that's wrong, not just as a moral matter, but it needs to be wrong as a legal matter. And part of why effective enforcement, whether it's antitrust enforcement or consumer protection enforcement, is critical, is if companies think, oh, I can get away with it, no one's going to catch me. We've seen this. People will try and get away with stuff thinking they're not going to get caught. And what I want people in Colorado to know, look at my record. We are on the case again and again and again. Fraudulent contractors trying to lie to people about taking down trees they don't take down. People cheating our Medicaid system. People cheating the government. We've been building up an office that is set up to hold accountable wrongdoers. At the same time, this is something that I've spent a lot of my life doing. There are a lot of entrepreneurs building great companies. I've celebrated entrepreneurship. They're creating jobs, new solutions. We've got so many great success stories in Colorado, companies that are doing things the right way. Both those things can be true.
The sinister actors, those who are simply in it for the money, to hell with the consequences, they're rare, aren't they? I mean, aren't most people in business for the right reasons? They want to create mutual benefit.
I do believe most people are good people. And so I would subscribe to that broad point. What I will say is, unfortunately, those bad actors can do a lot of damage because we know from our work, whether it's the fraudulent contractor case I mentioned or the Juul case I mentioned, the Purdue Pharma, it doesn't take that many companies to do extraordinary damage, seeing an opportunity to make money by hurting people. Let me give you a quick example on this, which comes from the telecom world. It's an obscure example to many people, but there's a company called WorldCom, which was basically engaging in a whole bunch of fraud, misreporting their earnings, lying to people, taking advantage of investors. Other companies ended up going under, making bad decisions because WorldCom was operating as a fraud. And you can, put different companies in there. People remember Enron and the whole fraudulent scheme
Right.
that they did. It can have huge impacts on markets and people's lives when companies are allowed to get big and do massive damage operating in a fraudulent way.
Well, and I introduced you a year or two ago to a friend of mine who founded a major roofing company. He agrees with me economically. He's a very much a free market advocate. On the other hand, he runs this company, and they are big now. They weren't when he started, but they're large now. And he plays by all the rules. He has to. You're watching him. I mean, not just you, but I
Yep.
mean, the system is going to watch him. But he gets undermined all day long after a big storm by fly-by-nights who come along, and they're not insured, so they don't have that overhead. They don't have to compete with his overhead. There are a lot of things that they don't do that they're required to do, and they get away with it. So I think we see, and I just use that as an example. I think we see that in all things. That's a possibility that the good actor, the good player, gets taken out by a bad actor.
It is a chance for me to offer a commercial announcement here, although it's a nonprofit commercial. If you are in a business, and contractor is one that comes to mind, moving would be another, where you know there are people who are cutting corners, who are engaging in illegal action, who are competing unfairly or engaging in fraud, please let us know about it at stopfraudcolorado.gov. And if you're a consumer who's been taken advantage of by a contractor or a moving company, please let us know about it at stopfraudcolorado.gov. We've got to set the right tone in Colorado that we don't tolerate these irresponsible bad actors, and that's something we all can be a part of. And also, one more commercial announcement, educate your friends and family. Because when you're going to hire a contractor, you're going to hire a mover, if you do your homework, you're going to figure out, like your friend Wayne, this guy's legit. He's served other people the right way, responsibly, where this other company, they're fly-by-night. I'm not sure about them. Do not take a chance, contractor, mover, what have you, with some company that has no track record, that has no proven ability to show they can deliver, because what you're setting yourself up for is a huge risk. And we've talked to people who've lost a lot of money because, or a harm happened and there's no insurance to pay for it. They broke, the whole roof, and then the contract was gone and there was no insurance for it. Those sorts of harms happen, and people can protect themselves.
You probably hear a lot of those stories with your consumer protection office within your department.
Every day. We get over 20,000 complaints every year. We're going to have our Consumer Protection Month coming up soon. We'll talk about the top complaints for the year. And sadly, contractor fraud is one of the top ones we hear about.
So while we're talking about these these businesses that act irresponsibly, they take advantage of the freedoms of our free market. Just this very day, as we visit, I believe the Supreme Court ruled against TikTok.
I was really afraid you're going to ask me this, Wayne, because the decision literally just came out. And I was driving here, and I was thinking to myself, Wayne's going to ask me about this case. So I will give you the highlight. It's a unanimous case decision. And this is important because you made a point earlier I can pull back, which is how do we think about the First Amendment and the Second Amendment? And the short answer is both of those are not absolute. Government can make reasonable regulations on free speech or on the right to bear arms. And with respect to free speech, TikTok's argument is banning us from operating while we're owned or influenced by China. They said that's a violation of free speech. A unanimous Supreme Court said the ability of China to get access to data from U.S. citizens on an ongoing basis poses a national security risk. And the Supreme Court said that requirement that TikTok either gets sold to an American company, which doesn't have that, call it national security risk, or ceases to operate. That is a law that passes First Amendment muster, kind of like you heard the famous no one can yell fire in a crowded theater. That's a restriction on free speech, but it's also protecting the broader public safety. So
that's a great analogy, but you actually can yell fire in a crowded theater, right?
Well, you raise an interesting point because I do want to give a little mention to swatting, which is another species of what I would call speech that is subject to criminal sanctions. If you call in a bomb threat and people are harmed because of it, whether it's their time, whether it's something happens in responding to a supposed bomb threat, that calling in a bomb threat is not protected by the First Amendment.
No, and nor should it be. But if I stand up in a theater and I shout fire because I smelled some smoke, or maybe something popped into my head and I suddenly was fearful that there was a fire. I sort of have a responsibility to yell fire.
Well,
in the theater.
if there is a fire, I think that you can't yell fire in a crowd theater. The premise is there is no fire. You're simply trying to create havoc that can harm people. And you put a point on this. Again, this is a whole other conversation. What's the intent of the person?
Mm-hmm.
I had the responsibility to argue a case in the U.S. Supreme Court involving stalking. And the case turned on what intent level is necessary to prosecute someone for engaging in stalking. Our position was Colorado law allows prosecution of stalking if the stalker, or if a reasonable person in the stalker's position would be aware that the victim would experience the actions as threatening to his or her physical safety. And the individual stalker in the case we were prosecuting said, I had no idea that she, CW was her initials, could have taken my actions as threatening. And the problem with that position is a delusional stalker or a devious stalker would be given room to do very harmful things and would be outside of any civil or legal liability. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court went against me in that case and said that in order to convict someone of stalking, you have to show that they've acted with reckless intent, which means they've disregarded something that they had a conscious awareness of. So there's a whole area of law on what level of knowledge someone has to have before they can be prosecuted for their speech. And unfortunately, you just happen to engage someone who's gone deep on this issue.
We could do a show on that in and of itself. I'd love to sometime.
The First Amendment has a lot of interesting twists and turns to it. And this TikTok case that we're just talking about is obviously one of them.
I believe, and I think you believe, that social media, unrestrained the way it pretty much is right now, is harmful to children. Tell me about that. Tell me why and how it's harmful to children and what you're doing about it and what you would do about it if you were the governor.
I'm going to start with Lori Schott, who is a Coloradan that I have such respect for. Lori lost her daughter, Anna. Anna, like many young people, spends time on social media. And Lori, after Anna died by suicide, looked at her Instagram account and found lots of posts that were encouraging her decline in mental health, including things like don't talk to your parents. They'll institutionalize you if you tell them how you're feeling. Young girls like Anna would see twice as much self-harm content as other people. We know, and unfortunately have run a social experiment, that young people spending lots and lots of time on social media aren't sleeping because the notifications go all hours of the night. They're interrupted during the school day. It encourages more drama and bullying. To your point, and you can do this through line, pre-2013-ish versus today, the state of mental health for young people is far worse. And social media, it's not the only cause, but it's a critical cause. The pandemic was a real challenge too. And of course, the two fit together. People are more isolated, more disconnected. They don't have people in their lives who they can talk to as they are facing whatever challenges they have. And we have to do something about it. I have worked to lobby Congress, Kids Online Safety Act, warning labels on social media. These have been bipartisan efforts. Congress is not showing action. I'm going to work this session here in Colorado to help provide some guardrails for how social media operates, including how easy it is to get fentanyl on social media, another problem that we know is happening. We wrote a report about that in our office. I'm now suing Facebook, Meta, and we're investigating TikTok because they have failed to operate these platforms responsibly. I mentioned this point about notifications at all hours of the night, marketing to kids under 13 against federal law to get them hooked. The fact that these dark holes operate the way they do and they don't do things to protect people, we have a lot to be concerned about in terms of how our young people are doing, and we need to address these platforms. Plus, and this is what I'm doing with the Jewel money, we need to invest in school community partnerships to improve the mental health of young people that we know is hurting.
You are actually taking legal action to help solve this. Can you give me a little detail on that?
Yeah, I'll first talk about the social media cases, then I'll talk about how we use the money from Jewel.
Yeah.
On these cases, we have gone to court, and we're in court leading a multi-state bipartisan effort in California court. And the argument we have is the way Meta is operating its platform violates Colorado's unfair and deceptive trade practices law. So, for example, Meta has said time and time again this product is completely safe. Young people have nothing to worry about. Their internal research said the opposite. They are using notifications at all hours of the night, knowing, because they keep this data, that they're keeping kids from sleeping. So they're, again, marketing a product, saying it's safe, and they know it's really happening. They know about this dark hole and dangerous content that kids are going down. And again, they haven't taken steps to fully change it. Now, they may say we have parental controls, but basically very few parents understand how to or are using these controls. So it's not really an effective protection for kids. Our kids are vulnerable. We've got to do more to help them. And that's very much top of my mind. We, as I said, sued Juul, got $32 million back. Literally, any day now, we're going to get the applications in because we put up $20 million of that to say to schools, work with people in your community and come up with programs to help preventative mental health, to get kids off their phones and to get kids building relationships with one another, with adults, so that they know they are part of a community and they're not isolated and lonely. And let me give you a positive example. In Holyoke, Colorado, Kyle Stump is the school district superintendent. He did a survey of students 5 or so years ago, and he asked the question, how many adults are in your life who you can talk to about how you're feeling, how you're doing? And the answer was 1. He said that was a real concern. So he made it the overarching priority to train teachers, those who worked in the school in different capacities, coaches, community members, to engage people, to really have time for how are you? How are you really doing? And to build that space. He did that survey again recently. The number was 8 people that kids could talk to. The difference between having 8 people in your life who you know are concerned about how you're doing, who know who you are, versus having 1 or 0 is a game changer. That's what we in Colorado have to do. When I'm governor, I want to make sure that we are changing the equation around the environment kids are growing up in. And that's one reason I want to do one more thing, Wayne, that's worth mentioning. I want to create a voluntary youth service program. So when kids graduate high school or college, they can spend a certain amount of time, 12, 18, 24 months, going to other communities, the San Luis Valley, Sterling, Western Slope, and work as law enforcement officers or as nurses or as teachers or as counselors or as firefighters as part of a service effort where they're going to feel a sense of purpose, where they're going to learn a work ethic to work hard, and where they're going to build a better sense of their own personal resilience, and they're going to live a more promising and meaningful life as a result.
We have now for a long time been a society in which parents raise their children, bring up their children to become college students and then hopefully professionals. Unfortunately, the market doesn't need that many professionals with sociology degrees. So we have a lot of people who have invested a lot up front in their lives, and then they find themselves not in great demand as young adults. And it's very disappointing when you see someone like that because they've played by all the rules. They've checked all the boxes. They've thought they've done everything right, and they're living in mom and dad's basement.
There's a worse situation. The person who goes to college for 2.5 years, drops out, has the debt from that experience, doesn't develop any credential, and is living in mom and dad's basement. So one of the goals I have as governor is we in Colorado need to really invest in what gets called career and technical education. We need to make sure that everyone who graduates high school graduates with an ability to do a job that they will love, they'll find meaning and dignity in, and make a good living. We're seeing a lot of electricians, a lot of plumbers getting close to the end of their careers, and we've got a shortage in critical professions because we don't have anymore the training pipelines that we need, the apprenticeship models. We have new job opportunities coming up in a range of areas that you can graduate from high school or from a credential in a community college and be very equipped to work on. We've got to be building the right training pathways for people, and we haven't done that. And that's part of why young people may not see the opportunity because they're instead feeling the frustration of this case you mentioned. But what if someone graduates and they're ready to be an electrician? They've got a mentor who is going to help bring them to the business and then will sell their business to them. There are electricians out there saying, I can't find anybody to sell my business to. So we need to do better as a society, and this is absolutely on my agenda as well.
We have such a shortage in the trades right now, and we have such a surplus in professional fields, people who have studied for professions, that the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago came out with a story about the new class of millionaires in the United States, and they're blue collar. These are people who work in HVAC, own mechanic shops, whatever it may be. But that class of worker is now becoming fabulous. I mean, they're making good money, better than they ever have in the past because of that shortage. So I see a lot of opportunity there for people who don't want to go off and do a traditional 4-year college stint without a real direct purpose for doing so.
And the way I frame this all, and when you talk to people in education, they will celebrate this. Everyone needs a personalized learning plan where they develop the competencies and ideally a credential that sets them on a path for success. And Poudre Valley High School in Fort Collins has really leaned into this. What they've found is by leaning into this and creating more future electricians, plumbers, construction workers, they've ended up having more people go to community college and more people go to college because they can afford it. And they do it on their timeline in the way that works for them. And that's what we need to create for everybody, which is what's your pathway to opportunity? And there's lots of different options. And we need to make sure that we're serving people with the range of options that they need and not, as you said, having this vision, well, everyone should go to college, when the reality is it doesn't work for everybody. And our whole system of skills development absolutely needs to be reimagined.
I want to segue into civility, civilized dialogue among the right and the left and everything in between. You clerked. This is impressive. I got to tell you. You clerked for Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Byron Whizzer White. He was called Whizzer White because he was was he quarterback or running back? Running back for the University of Colorado Buffaloes way back when.
Go Buffs.
You clerked for both of these individuals who made huge marks on history. Tell me a little bit about that. How were these two justices different from one another?
I also want to talk about how they were the same, because a lot of times people gloss over that. It was a remarkable experience. Justice White was retired at the time I was working for him, so he only had one sitting with the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, and he had a lot of time on his hands. So I got to know him and have a relationship with him that some of his clerks, by the way, didn't have. Both of them were very intense. So I'll give you a White story that I didn't experience, which is he had a rule with his clerks. He said, you have 10 days to get me a draft. If you get me a draft, I'll edit your draft. If you don't, I will write my own. So one year, the clerks are talking, and they're like, Christmas doesn't count as one of those days, does it? Well, it counted, and that clerk didn't get the draft in on time, and Justice White drafted it. Justice Ginsburg and Justice White were extraordinary jurists, brilliant, and one of the benefits for me was being pushed, the level of excellence that they both pushed me to, and that's something that I am so grateful for. They both also were extremely thoughtful about the interaction of law and Supreme Court decisions and the political process. And so a point you adverted to earlier, I'll pick up here, which is Roe versus Wade. White was really concerned that the Supreme Court too quickly jumped into that issue, and he had joined the majority in the Griswold case. So he wasn't against the doctrine of what's called substantive due process as a doctrine. He was nervous about the court occupying the field and short-circuiting what then was an emerging political conversation and discourse around what type of protection for access to abortion care is appropriate. Justice Ginsburg, in a speech she gave at NYU, when I was there as a law student, I heard her give the speech, talked about that very issue and said the Supreme Court jumped in too quickly. The difference was she, in her confirmation hearing, said she believed the right to abortion was protected by the Constitution. And notably, she saw it grounded in the concept of equal protection, that men and women should both have the same level of control of the reproductive health systems. And that was something she believed. But she also believed what a point that White was getting at, which is when the Supreme Court gets into an area, it needs to be thoughtful about when it gets in and when it short-circuits the political process. A final point on White on this same theme. The Miranda case is one that White dissented from because White thought, again, the court was he believed in judicial restraint. He said the court should not be so quick to occupy this field and prescribe what we now all know as Miranda warnings. But when Miranda came before the court later, he voted to extend Miranda because he said it becomes such a part of the fabric of our law. So when Justice Ginsburg spoke at a conference that I held in honor of Justice White, she said, no one in the Supreme Court respected this doctrine, stare decisis, more than Justice White. So I gave a speech recently to the Colorado Bar. It's on the website, coag.gov. You can see an extended version of what I just said. But I learned so much from both of them. And when I think about my image of what a Supreme Court justice is, both of them come to mind.
Now, you can be 100% pro-choice, thinking that a woman ought to be able to make this decision on her own. And also think that, which I'm not in that camp, by the way. I believe that we ought to have some legal protections for the third party in that equation. You know that. We just simply disagree on that. But you can be totally in favor of a woman's right to choose and think that the Roe v. Wade ruling in 1973 was faulty.
Yes, and there's two criticisms that you could mention, and Justice Ginsburg essentially embraced at least both of them. One is you could say the idea of grounding the constitutional right to protect abortion access is justified by equal protection. I mentioned that was her position. That case, as decided by Justice Blackmun, used this substantive due process doctrine. So one can argue about the doctrine. One can also argue, as Ginsburg noted, that maybe it shouldn't have been decided in 1973 when and how it was. It was important for society before the Supreme Court gets involved to have more of a public discourse. And so there's two, at least, call it grounds for criticizing Roe versus Wade. Justice Ginsburg has made both of those. And in her confirmation hearing in 1993, she said that precedent needed to be respected and justified on equal protection. By that time, the Supreme Court had reaffirmed Roe in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, where the court looked at should we overrule Roe and said, from a stare decisis perspective, the thing has been decided, it would be too disruptive to overturn Roe. And obviously Dobbs didn't pay heed to that. And one thing about Dobbs that's worth emphasizing is Chief Justice Roberts didn't agree with the Dobbs decision. Dobbs said any form of abortion limitation, any abortion ban is okay under the Constitution. That was the Dobbs ruling. Roberts wrote separately to say, why are we deciding that? All we have to decide is that Mississippi's law, that was a 12-week restriction, passed constitutional muster. So he had a more, call it, restrained approach than the Dobbs majority. We're now living in the world of Dobbs, and we're seeing what abortion bans mean in terms of sometimes women being denied health care that can save their lives and kids who've been raped being told they have to bear a child to term. So this is a debate that's not going away, obviously. It's happening. We in Colorado have spoken pretty clearly, including at the ballot box this fall, and we're going to have to see how it plays out because now with the new administration, access to mifepristone, which is used in 2/3 of Colorado abortions, is potentially going to get restricted. So we'll see where it all goes.
While we're on abortion for just a moment, and then I'd like to move on to talk about your efforts toward political civility. But while we're on this this topic that is often discussed in an uncivilized manner, you are the governor's lawyer, you're the people's lawyer, you're the top legal official in Colorado, and were when the Colorado legislature, and with the blessing of Governor Polis's pen, it's very easy to get an abortion in Colorado. The law is written so that it cannot cost you money. Even if you can't afford to get to the abortion clinic, your ride will be covered. There's no barrier to having an abortion, and I can understand how that is beneficial to people who really think this is an important right among women and men. I get that. But when you have a live birth in Colorado, even if you're well insured, you're privately insured, you're going to fork out thousands and thousands of dollars to bring that baby home alive from a hospital. Do you think, and I've asked Governor Polis this, and I'll tell you what he said after, but do you think we should also pave the way for people to have live births instead of abortions? So, because you get what you pay for. And abortion year over from 22 to 2023, last data I have, they were up 4% in Colorado, which is not a problem if you think that's a good thing for someone to do, to exercise that choice. But live births are down, and we need live births in Colorado. Do you agree with that, first of all, that we need more children?
Well, there's a lot in your point.
Yes.
I want to pick out a few points. First, I want to say the fact that kids are less, the fact that we're less likely to have kids in our society, I think is part of our connection crisis. So what you mentioned when we've talked about how young people are doing, one of the byproducts is young people are more lonely and isolated. They're not getting married as much. They're not having families as much. So for me, our societal connection crisis is absolutely top of mind because I want to have thriving families and communities in Colorado, and I'm concerned about where that is right now. On access to abortion, I do want to add a very important additional point. 4% more abortions in Colorado is largely driven by people from Texas and other states where they can't get access to abortion care coming here. And so it is not necessarily, when you look at those statistics, like more Coloradans are having abortions. More abortions are being performed in Colorado because of restrictions elsewhere, like Texas notably. The next point is, how much does it cost to get an abortion? I need to check what your premise is because my understanding is subsidies that are available are often privately funded. I don't believe the government is funding people to get access to get abortion care. So I need to double check that.
Well, no,
premise.
but there's a mandate on insurance providers that they can't stick you with a bunch of out-of-pocket costs. And I think Medicaid, they would never hit you with out-of-pocket costs. And there is some sort of a program. We'd have to go over the law. But that does help with the transportation costs. My only point is it's not really in the details. It's you get what you know that you get more of what you subsidize. You get less of what you tax.
Yeah, no, and I think the point you're making is a point about healthcare more broadly. And I'm glad we could talk about it because when I think about affordability, I mentioned this earlier, housing is obviously top of mind, but healthcare, for many people, the cost that they have to get for healthcare is exactly what you said. It's often a surprise. They're not told up front. Sometimes it's unnecessary. They've been referred in a certain way to someone who charges more. And we need to really think hard and figure out how we can help people who are getting health care not end up saddled with huge bills that are unexpected. And then the other issue that's come out of this is medical debt, which is the number one cause of bankruptcy. We worked on a bill to address that issue where if you've got a surprise bill or a contested bill, they can't start proceeding debt collection against you. And if you do have medical debt, we've now capped those rates because we're concerned about the predatory tactics that have been being used. So your overall point, and birth is obviously one example, but there are probably a lot of other examples in the healthcare system of people being treated in ways that can be problematic.
And I asked Governor Polis if he would sign something that came across his desk. No understanding that the devil's in the details.
Yep.
But just in general, your general philosophy. When I asked the governor, "What's your general philosophy if a bill came across your desk to lower the cost of through subsidization, whether private sector, whether an insurance mandate, whatever it may be, to lower the cost of having a child, would you sign it?" And he said, "If you could get something like that on my desk, I would." Would you, if a bill came across your desk that made it easier, more affordable to have a live birth, would you sign that bill?
I want to see Governor Polis's answer and raise him, which is not only do I want to make sure that people who are having kids aren't getting hit with these unanticipated out-of-pocket costs, I want to make sure that we're building communities where we are more connected to one another, less isolated, so people are getting married and having kids. And I want to lower the cost for child care, which is another deterrent to having kids because that's become so much more expensive. So if you think about the situation in Colorado where people are more isolated, lonely, less likely to get married, less likely to have kids because maybe the cost you mentioned, but even more so because how much childcare is, those are challenges that I want to take on as governor.
We brought up your work with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Byron White. They got along even when they disagreed on issues. And you and I have sat here now for more than an hour talking, as we often have in the past, about things we don't necessarily agree on. That's not really. We see a lot of conflict in the public now when they're talking about politicians, public policy. Tell me about that and what your vision is for. I know we've talked in the past. You have a vision for bringing civility back to public rhetoric.
I'll start with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You mentioned she had a great relationship with Justice White. Totally true. She had a great relationship with Justice Antonin Scalia.
Right.
And one year, Scalia's clerks were seeing Scalia send flowers to Justice Ginsburg and said, "Why are you sending her flowers? She doesn't vote your way." And he said, "Some things are more important than votes." The other thing she got, steel sharpens steel. I love our conversations because you push me to have to defend why would you justify this form of regulation, like the conversation we had, for example, about insulin. That's an important pushback, and I don't want to just live in an echo chamber where everyone is saying everything identically. I want to live in a world where people have different cultural, ethnic, religious traditions, where people have different intellectual perspectives, and we really listen to one another. And the best of America is the world that I just described. It's the world of Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg. And why is that world vanishing? I'm going to come back to social media. On social media, what gets clicks is outrage, demonization, and polarization. If you see someone on social media say to someone else, you might be right, I have to think about it, that's not going to get a lot of clicks. If you see someone else say, I'm curious about something you said, what's your source for that? Where'd you get that information? I'd like to check it out. That doesn't get many clicks. Unfortunately, the norms of social media are polluting our body politic. They're degrading the way we talk to one another, the way we treat one another. And I'm committed to always walking the walk of honoring respectful discourse. And one of the great things I've had in public life in Colorado is many people, Hugh McCain, who's a former minority leader, and a lot of others who are in leadership, thinking about Cleve Simpson from the San Luis Valley, Rose Puglisi here from Colorado Springs, are people who value dialogue. And we got to hold on to that in Colorado. That's who we are in Colorado. I recognize there are pressures that are undermining it. I'm committed to it. I believe that's how we make better public policy, and that's how we live with one another so that everyone can live together in harmony.
Very good. Well, thank you for coming on my show, Phil. It's good to see you again, and we'll have you back on to talk about the First Amendment and a couple of other things where we could do a whole show just on one topic. But thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it, and good luck on your run for higher office.
Thank you, Ann. Appreciate the time. Thanks for being you.
Thanks. Our guest today is Colorado Attorney General Phil Weiser, a former law school dean who is running for governor. Voters first elected Mr. Weiser in 2018. He self-identifies as the people's lawyer, and in that capacity, Mr. Weiser knocked out Big Vape, generating settlement funds to pay for juvenile mental health services. He fights to protect children from internet dangers, and he also led the multi-state battle to stop the monopolization of Kroger and Albertsons stores. That's Safeway, or King Soopers and Safeway respectively, and a lot of other popular grocer brands. Mr. Weiser obtained unique insight into society and law by clerking for Supreme Court Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Byron Whizzer White, the latter of whom voted against the Roe v. Wade ruling of 1973, which Mr. Weiser supports. Most importantly, Phil and I have for years enjoyed geeking out over legal questions. He tolerates me. I learn from him. Welcome, Professor and Attorney General, to Wayne's Word.